if I'm able, if the video don't.
Now it's recording. So we'll just leave that running the entire time. That's recording now. And now it's recording. Now you can record Francesca.
Who is this man?
All right then, let's go.
I'm really pleased, Tony, that you have finally made it. We've been talking about this for about a year and a half or 2 years. Tony and I are members of the Australian monarchists. Obviously, we would like the monarchy to stay and the Queen to stay, and we're really not that interested in the Republic movement. But that's not what's going to be our talk today. Tony very kindly gave us a talk about his family history, and I was so impressed. About a year and a half ago.
Yes, long time.
Our Vice President, who passed away, David Cowling, was also in the same group, and it was so good that I thought it might encourage the rest of you to put something together about your family history. I think we think, oh, it's just my family, there's nothing exciting about it. But there's something exciting about everybody's family.
The Tony family.
The Tony family, the Tony Clarke family. Tony Clarke family is very, very, very interesting. So take your pads out and take some notes. Thank you very much, Tony.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Copious notes.
Good.
Right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. How many of you have had an ancestor sent out from England, Scotland or Ireland as a convict, or even as a free settler, on a sailing ship? So, you know, that's where we're starting. How many had ancestors arrive by boats and planes, and or how many of you just came as immigrants in the last 40 years? My name is Tony Clarke, and my topic today is the achievements of a convict girl sent out. And I forgot to put the music. The music. Just a little bit.
And I can't help it because I don't understand which button to push.
I don't know.
I smell the salty bean. Yes. It's
Turn it up, some of us are a bit deaf.
Oh, that was last time. It's only background.
It's only good background. It's only for a couple of minutes. But it's, the music is Lady Eleanor by Linda's Farm, which was a 70s song. I want to thank you all for being here today. I know many of you come from a long distance, and I intend to make it worthwhile for you to have made the effort. I want to thank Francesca Scalaro and the Brunswick Community History Group for allowing me to speak. I'm a 7th generation descendant of Eleanor Wainwright, who came on the First Fleet, and I've heard the stories many times about her and many of her descendants. In preparing this talk today, I've researched the work of my relatives and consulted widely to bring you the best of what that I can and what I hope will be an interesting and many times amusing account. I have a passion about this, as Eleanor, whose descendants and my other ancestors had so much to do with the founding and development of many parts of Australia. This talk is for all those who are interested in learning how the little people of our colonies helped develop us from such humble origins to suddenly being the nation that it is today, particularly as their children became the leaders of society. What you're going to learn today is why you should be proud of your heritage and living in Australia, whether your ancestor came on the First Fleet like mine, or in the later migrant wave, or you arrived yourself as a migrant. The privations of the First Fleet settlers and later arrivals suffered are very similar. If your ancestors arrived this way, it means you've come from strong pioneering stock. And you have someone to be proud of, and your achievements are a continuation of their achievements. It is very similar to the boats arriving on our north coast now. The convict ships were no larger than what many of the current refugees have. They had the similar fears and hopes about what they were coming to and for what they were leaving. The convent girl was Eleanor Wainwright. She is also known as Esther Eccles. As I've seen both Esther and Eccles as Jewish names, it may be that she was Jewish and took the Eleanor Wainwright name either on conversion to Christianity, probably as a Presbyterian in those days, or simply as a safeguard. However, she does seem to have been known as Eleanor Wainwright much more throughout her life in the colonies, with Ellen coming up as the shortened name for most of the time. Ellen was born at Riston in Lancashire about 1769. When only a young woman of 17, she was in trouble with the law for stealing clothing. She was tried, found guilty, and sentenced to 7 years transportation. She made the voyage to Port Jackson on the Prince of Wales. This is a list of all the people who were on the Prince of Wales that came, and her name is mentioned right here as Wainwright, Ellen Wainwright or Esther Eccles, who put both names on the list. She received punishment during the voyage for stealing. She formed a liaison with the seaman James Wilson and had a child in 1789, whom she named Mary Ann. When she was sent to Norfolk Island in 1790, Mary Ann went too, but the little girl died there in 1792. Ellen had 2 other children on Norfolk Island by an unknown father, Henry, born 1791, who apparently died young, and another, Mary Ann, born 1795, named after the baby who died. Eleanor arrived with the rest of the First Fleet into Port Jackson on 26th of January 1788. As hers was mainly a female's boat, she was not offloaded until 2 weeks after the men had been offloaded off their ships. She was still on there for another 2 weeks, even sitting in the port. Now,
Which ship was she on? Prince
Prince of Wales.
Thanks a lot. Good.
Eleanor was then sent to Norfolk Island on the Sirius. That's Norfolk Island there. That thing's probably very hard to see in this light. Hard in the distance anyway. The story I've heard is the ship sank in the harbour and she had to swim ashore. It was actually the Second Fleet that went to Norfolk Island. Ellen met Thomas Guy on Norfolk Island. He was a convicted highwayman, sent to Botany Bay on the Matilda and the Third Fleet. Thomas and Ellen remained together in Norfolk Island for 17 years, during which time they had 3 more children. Anne on the 28th of February 1800, Elizabeth on the 13th of November 1802, and Francis on the 13th of June 1805. Eleanor was one of the convicts with a farming background. At Norfolk, she had a farm that provided a lot of food for the Sydney settlement. She had her own farmhouse and was very well settled. However, she was uprooted when Norfolk was closed the first time. All of Ellen's daughters married, and today there are hundreds of descendants with her blood in their veins. Her Blood in Our Veins was the book listing the descendants, written by Irene Donald, with a lot of assistance from my second cousin, Cherry Cummings, who still lives in Sydney. When the Norfolk Island settlement was abandoned, Thomas and Ellen, with the 4 children, were sent to Van Diemen's Land and given a grant of land at New Norfolk. Although not mentioned in the shipping lists, Mary Ann lived with the family on the farm at Magra, and Magra was over here somewhere. Magra was a tiny settlement just off the Lyell Highway, about 22 miles from Hobart. Here the early pioneers had built for themselves a meeting place, a square-fronted solid building of roughly hewn stones plastered together with lime and mortar. The building was dedicated as a Methodist chapel in 1837.
Excuse me, Anthony, would you like questions during your presentation or after your presentation?
Probably after. Well, I can take some questions if you want to. Yeah.
Well,
We'll go through.
whichever is more comfortable for you, because you may like to tell us the whole story and then we ask questions.
Live at the end, thanks.
At the end?
Well, if you've got any pressing questions, just ask them, because this does go on for quite a while.
It's a great story, though.
Clear water.
Again on the land that was granted to them, Thomas and Ellen built a new farm and supplied food to the colony in Tasmania. Ellen died on the 8th of November 1839, aged 72 years. So she was out here for a long time. And was buried in the churchyard at Magra. Ellen's tombstone is located close to the lower northwest corner of the graveyard in the wooded area. And that's Ellen's gravestone there. And that's her husband, Thomas Guy's gravestone.
And what was Thomas's surname? I missed that.
Gay, G-A-Y.
G-A-Y.
In 1988, the First Fleet Fellowship dedicated a memorial plaque to Ellen, fixed to the top of her headstone with which carries a quite durable inscription. That's the inscription that you can still see. That's sacred to the memory of Eleanor Gay, or this one I think, who died 8th of November 8, 1839, aged 79 years, erected by her affectionate daughter Anne Bush. Next to it is a headstone for Thomas Guy, whom Eleanor had married, also erected by Anne Bush to her father, who died in August 1842, aged 89 years. Here you can also see the plaque erected by the Fellowship of First Fleeters in 1988, celebrating the 200th anniversary of the fleet's arrival. I was part of the group that went to Tasmania with my mother, father, Cherry Cummings, my second cousin Betty Greenwood, and her husband for the celebrations. Eleanor was our First Fleet ancestor on my mother's side. She was there for the founding of Sydney and for the early years of Norfolk Island, where she arrived on the Second Fleet, and then for the founding of Hobart, or founding of parts of Tasmania. She was only one of the two original First Fleeters who were sent to Tasmania. Most of her children were born on Norfolk Island, thus giving all her descendants some rights to live in Norfolk Island. In Norfolk Island, you can't just go and live there. You actually have to be related to somebody who was born there. So we go right back to that thing, probably 20,000 or 30,000 descendants now.
That's actually changing now a little bit.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay. Her children were freeborn and became part of the aristocracy of Tasmania, both in their own right and by marriage. So it went from one generation of convict up to the aristocracy. Basically how it worked. This is an account of Ellen written by her daughter Mary Ann, which I shall read to you, even though it is titled by Irene Donald, who wrote her blood in her veins as being fiction based on fact. I think it's very well written and shows that Ellen was well educated by the Reverend Knockwood in Hobart, and that she did appreciate where she had come from the trials of her mother and how she'd become part of the new colony. And that's part of this here. Now she'd married one of the Lascelles, and she became Mary Ann Lascelles. The Lascelles, Denny's, and Lascelles Road, and all those people. And so she writes, "My name is Mary Ann Lascelles, and I'm writing this from Geelong in the Port Phillip district, that's now called Victoria, after Her Majesty in England. I'd like to tell you the story of my mother, Eleanor Wainwright. Well, she was an ordinary woman, you know, but to me it's the ordinary people that helped to build this land. Now, Ellen was one of the first white people to come. Yes, she was a convict, and I've heard all about this, that the women of the First Fleet, and how they was dirty, drunken, depraved and degraded. But I asked you, what chance was there for any of them? 4 men to every woman. Could they stay pure even if they wanted to? Well, me mother was 17 when she was took. Stealing a petticoat, woolen cloak and a silk hat, it was said. Now, she didn't say much about the old country, so I guess we'll never know for sure. But I always felt that Mr. Standen gave them to Ellen, and when the return on his investment wasn't what he expected, he cried thief. Well, like I say, we'll never know. She took another name to try to protect her folks. She was really Esther Eccles, she said. From the castle at Lancaster, she was sent to Portsmouth. Then, with 48 other women, had an invigorating sea trip in the Prince of Wales. Invigorating, yes. She said once, it wasn't the crowding she minded. Most folks was used to that, to worse. It was the smell, them all being sick below there in the dark.
Oh, yes.
I still remember when they took us from Norfolk Island to Van Diemen's Land. That was bad enough, but nothing like 9 months on end. It's a wonder any of them lived to breed. I remember I was born on Norfolk Island in 1795. My mother had had a daughter, Mary Ann, to James Wilson, a sailor on the Sirius, in her second year at Sydney Coast. They was near starved to death. Governor Phillip was expecting help from England, food, seeds and tools to grow more food. But what did he get? More mouths, more convicts. Ha! And they weren't farmers. They were petty crims. What did they know about the land? And the land was all wrong. Hot in winter. The soil was not English soil used to being dug. Just sand and grass. Black natives and odd animals. Birds that mocked their efforts and deer-like animals that hop. Kookaburras and kangaroos. Well, Governor Phillip sent some of his people to Norfolk Island, and Alan and her babe were in the second lot sent to grow food there to support the colony. My mother was on the Sirius when it was wrecked there. The first baby died on Norfolk. I was born, given the same name as her that died. My papers say father unknown, but I heard a whisper that it was James Lucas. I had a brother Henry, but he didn't live. My mother became Thomas Guy's woman. Well, it was a Norfolk marriage, really. He was a highwayman, a strong, hard man. She had 3 more girls from him, Anne, Elijah and Frances. They were both time expired now. Well, she only had 7 years and he had life. And we had a hut and tried to scratch a living from the soil. But it was hard. The crops was blighted and we had empty bellies and near naked bodies when they sent us to Van Diemen's Land. Thomas and Ellen were given land at New Norfolk, even a shingled hut by the river there. It was called the Hills by the settlers. The government wanted it called Elizabethtown, but the people called it New Norfolk after Norfolk Island. My first husband, Dennis McCartney, built the first house there. He was a man of action, my Dennis. He was a convict too, although more your Irish political prisoner, not a common lag. Dennis made money. We had large grants of land, and Governor Macquarie and his wife stayed in our house. We had entry to Government House too, something most other emancipists couldn't get. Dennis had boats built on the Derwent. He had been to Port Phillip long before it was settled. They'd been up here to Port Phillip well before 1835. He'd come up in the Geordie. There was money to be made from trading with the sealers, hard men living rough with black jeans for wives, although they were more like slaves, swimming up and clubbing the seals for their men. Dennis was the first to find coal at Macquarie Harbour too, even though it cost him a boat to do so. We was comfortable, getting almost to be the gentry of the land, although Dennis had some trouble with Captain Lascelles, who later became her second husband, trying to get him for smuggling rum. My sister Anne's husband, Dennis Watson Bush, him that used to be Reverend Bobby Knockwood's Clarke, was running a coach between Hobart Town and New Norfolk. It was Davey taught me to read and write. Dennis always wanted us to improve. Dennis got my mother respectable, married by the Reverend Knockwood to Thomas Guy the year after me and Dennis was married. Eliza married William Wheeler, a seafaring man, while he and William Hobson, Frances' husband, were all old lags. Who else was there around? William Hobson had been convicted at 13 years old for robbery. He was supposed to hang. Things were pretty tough in old England, because it was Hobson, and Hobson's Bay is named after that Hobson. William Wheeler was the one who brought the Rebecca with Hobson and who else came? In 1835, June 6, 1835, when they came to settle Victoria.
Oh no, a very valuable letter, I would have said.
Yes. Where was I? Your thoughts do run on when you're getting on in life, which is about 60 or 70 when she wrote this. Yes, Davey was running a coach on Dennis's Road, although he was never paid for it, not by the government. Oh, they offered a reward, right enough. Dennis built it and claimed the reward, but he was drowned in the Derwent before he could collect it. And me, well, I married Thomas Lascelles. They looked queer at me, 4 months a widow marrying again, but a lone woman was fair game. Thomas had been in the 73rd Regiment, a captain no less. He'd been Governor Davies' secretary until he had to resign. I thought it was a step up, him being free. Well, I was free-born myself, but life with Thomas was not a bed of roses. He was a magistrate at Richmond, till he was outed. I don't know why he was outed. He left us at Froggatt, which is the name of the property, his farm, and was editor of the Colonialist newspaper in Hobart. That fell through and he came back to Millbrook, Dennis's property. And all this was just enough visits home to give me 8 of his children. Millbrook was sold for Dennis's and my children, and I didn't want Thomas's spendthrift ways to take it all, but he went bankrupt and spent the money held in trust for them too. He went to Victoria. We had nothing. I was glad Davey had taught me. I opened a girls' school in Argyle Street, Hobart, to support my children. Little enough came from Thomas, but our children have done well. Edwin, Thomas Jr., Martha's husband, Charles Denny's, her cousin, are wool brokers in Tannis and Geelong. Denny's Lascelles. I'm living with Martha and Charles. Thomas didn't send for us. He's been in the Legislative Council, been made a Justice of the Peace, then outed again. All his life, his flash deals, connections and good blood have led him nowhere. But I was telling my mother's story, wasn't I? Although I dare say my own has been interesting enough. I could tell you about the time the bushrangers came. Now that was strange. They knew everything of value in the house, had a list. Someone put them up to it, all right. Well, Alan and Thomas both died at New Norfolk. An inquest on my mother in 1839 found she died of a visitation of God. No doubt he'd be looking for me sooner or later. And I'd like to think back to the good old days. My little Sophie, apple of Dennis's eye, he named a boat after her, playing in the sun by the Derwent River, and of the days when Dennis and old Thomas, my stepfather, were chasing bushrangers, and they seemed so close I could touch them. Mary Ann Wainwright was aged 20 when she married Dennis McCarthy at New Norfolk on the 8th of December 1811. Dennis McCarthy was an Irish political prisoner who was transported on the Friendship to New South Wales in 1802. Dennis was with the earliest settlers to be sent to the Derwent to start the settlement there, arriving with Lieutenant Bowen. By the time the Norfolk Islanders arrived, Dennis had already established his house there. The Reverend Knockwood stayed in Dennis's house in 1808, but it said they got rather wet as the roof was not finished. Where was that? This runs through all the children from Mary Ann Wainwright and John, and that's meant to be the Rebecca that came to Melbourne, Port Phillip in 1835. The Reverend Knockwood stayed in McCarthy's house in 1808, as I said, and he wrote, poignantly written here by the Reverend Knockwood, Tuesday the 3rd, 1808, at daylight we sent out 2 of our men a kangarooing, and they were to meet us at the first river. I killed a duck and they brought kangaroo. Breakfasted there, and at 12 proceeded up the river to the first fall. Got there about 4, took refreshment, came down to Dennis McCartney's where we dined. Sent the men to fish for eels. They caught some and we had them for supper. Slept there and had a very wet night. The house was not covered in. Now, when I read this story, I feel emotional, tears almost coming up. Who else was affected? I mean, it's just a brilliant story about that first fleeter and how she was at Norfolk and sent down all around the place. Now we're moving to the next generation. There's 4 surviving daughters of Eleanor, who all married. There were the children. Mary Ann married Dennis McCartney, as we've just heard. She had 3 children with them, Sophia, James and Edward. We don't know anything about them and their children. However, after Dennis's death, Mary Ann married Lieutenant Thomas Allen Lascelles of the 73rd Regiment, who had often pursued Dennis, and many people thought he may have been responsible for Dennis's death when he drowned in the Derwent, just before picking up his money for building the road. So it was unusual to hear of Mary marrying Thomas. The tree shows that they had 8 children with them. The 8 children are around here somewhere. Thomas was the secretary to the governor of Tasmania, who had not been pleased with him consorting with a convict girl, but was much happier after they'd married. Thus, by the 2nd generation, the family were part of the aristocracy in Tasmania. The Lascelles are well known in Victoria, with the naming of Lascelles Road, Toorak after them, and the Denny's Lascelles land agents and agricultural companies that used to be around Victoria. Apparently, in researching of her blood in our veins, their descendants were not too keen in being recognised as having a convict heritage, even if it was from the First Fleet. But eventually they came around, and now I believe are quite happy with the connection. Anne Guy was the 2nd daughter of Eleanor, and the first from her marriage to Thomas Guy. On the 5th of September 1814, Anne married David Watson Bush, who was the clerk of the Reverend Nobby Knockwood. The family tree at page 24 of her Blood in Our Veins shows they had 4 children. These 4 children here. Margaret Bush, born 1814, died at 16 in 1830. Mary Ann, that's Margaret Bush, who was born 1814. Then Mary Ann was born on the 15th of February 1817 and died 6 days later on February 21st, 1817. John Bush was born on 1818 and died in 1886. So he lasted 78 years. David Bush Sr. did quite well for himself, owning the Bush Hotel, New Norfolk, and other hotels in New Norfolk and Hobart, as well as running a coach between Hobart and New Norfolk. So just as his sister Mary had married quite well, so did Anne to a person who made a success of himself in the colonies. So, put your Bush Hotel there. And we've got Elizabeth Guy was the next daughter, born to Alan Wainwright and Thomas Guy on Norfolk Island on the 8th of October 1802. So Elizabeth has the most descendants of all, including my family. She married William Wheeler. William had been transported to Sydney on the Elmora and then sent straight down to Van Diemen's Land on the Pilot, arriving on the 24th of September 1817. William had several run-ins with the authorities and received a good few lashings. However, in between 2 of these, he must have met Elizabeth, because on the 8th of October 1819, Anne, the daughter of William Wheeler and Elizabeth Guy, was born. In 1821, their son Edward was born. After a few more floggings, William was finally granted his free certificate number 170 on the 6th of August 1823. The same day, their next son, John, was born. On the 24th of July 1826, William Wheeler and Elizabeth Guy finally married. So living in sin wasn't just something that modern people do nowadays. It's quite common. William Wheeler was a sailor. He worked on the Frederick, a ship that travelled out of the colony, and on the Henrietta packet that travelled to the Gordon River, and later on a boat called the Spring. On the 24th of April 1819, he sailed on the sloop Governor Sorrel for Launceston. He seemed to settle down after marrying Elizabeth, as he then ran a ferry from New Norfolk to Hobart. He had a house and premises at New Norfolk and had property worth £350. He and Elizabeth had more children. Rebecca in 1828, who died at 15 months, Thomas William in 1830, William Henry in 1832, who died in April 1833. Then they lost their son William, killed by a falling tree at the age of 12. In 1833, also William Wheeler advertised in one of the papers there, "The public are hereby cautioned against harbouring my daughter, Anne Wheeler, she having absconded from my house at New Norfolk without any provocation. All persons harbouring or concealing the said Anne Wheeler will be prosecuted with the utmost rigour of the law." 1833 was not turning out to be a good year for William Wheeler. Why had Anne run away from home? Well, she was almost 13 at the time. Had she met my ancestor Thomas Bilston, the man she married in New Norfolk 2 years later in 1835? I wonder. Anne and Tom moved sometime after that to Victoria. In 1838, the Wheelers must have decided to leave Tasmania and follow Thomas and Anne Bilston to Victoria, because the Launceston Advertiser, on the 30th of August 1838, shipping list advertises Launceston, August 27, 1838, sloop Rebecca, Wheeler, master from Hobart Town, bound for Port Phillip, put into Launceston from stress of weather, departed August 29, 1838. Sloop Rebecca was 12 tons for Port Phillip. Passengers Elizabeth Wheeler, John and William Wheeler. If you know your history, you may know that the Rebecca was the boat that John Bachman and Matthew Flinders came to Victoria on June 6, 1834, and started the colony in Melbourne. I believe at the time of its arrival that it may have been captained by William Wheeler, who then later owned the boat. Eleanor Wainwright and her descendants had been at the forefront of settlement in Sydney, Norfolk Island, Tasmania, and now Victoria. This drawing, well, let's pretend to be a drawing of Rebecca. Drawing of Rebecca shows a much smaller boat than the Rebecca drawing I have somewhere at home on a 1934 front page edition of the Argus, commemorating the 100th anniversary of Bachman and Flinders' arrival. I've tried to find it in the newspaper, I just can't find it, but somewhere it will be in my collection, because I don't think anybody else would have that 1934 newspaper.
Are you talking about the Argus?
Yes, the old one.
The Ballarat Mechanics Institute has an entire collection of Argus.
Oh, good. Well, I must go up there and have a look.
Please, they can just bring them first, because they're in their dungeon. They may have digitized them, don't they? No, I don't know.
All right. Also, it's George Yarrabilson, one of their children, was the first white male child born in Victoria. He was born on the 10th of August 1838 at Arthur's Creek, which is just north of Hurstbridge. Possibly Elizabeth was coming across for the birth of their second grandson, knowing the child was due. Now we've got a very interesting story here of Bill Wheeler visiting London with Elizabeth. This shows they had plenty of wealth to be able to travel to London after Bill had become a free man. One of these, just saw it was written up in one of the papers, I think somewhere. One of these New Norfolk boatmen, an English sailor, Bill Wheeler by name, who had settled in the country, suddenly took the homesickness. Accordingly, having stowed his kit, he and a fair companion embarked for London. Arrived in the modern Babylon, the poor woman, attracted no doubt by the strange sights which everywhere met her gaze, found herself all at once separated from her protector. The locality is differently stated to have been London Bridge or Charing Cross. Her immediate alarm on finding herself alone, she was a native of Norfolk Island, having subsided, she gave breath to a shrill and prolonged cooey, cooey, the common signal of the Australian forester, to the no small amazement of the passers-by, who, flocking around her, earnestly inquired what was amiss. "Matter," she responded, Mrs. Wheeler. "Why, nothing's the matter, only I'm lost Bill Wheeler, and so I set up a cooey so that he might know where I was." "Cooey," returned one of the crowd in admiring wonder. "Bill Wheeler," ejaculated another. "Who the devil's Bill Wheeler?" "Who's Bill Wheeler?" retorted this currency lady, someone born in the colonies, they were all known as currency lads, in amazement. Who's Bill Wheeler? Why, he's the New Norfolk boatman, to be sure. And where's New Norfolk? Why, at the falls on the Derwent, to be sure. They don't think it was the Derwent in England. During the course of this interrogatory, Bill, who had heard the well-known sound, came up as it was repeated, exclaiming, "Down your kangaroo eyes, do you think you're in the bush now?" So saying, he walked away with his his fair partner, whom it was said he shortly after purposely or unintentionally lost again. The poor soul wandered about until, weary and worn, she entered one of the low houses at Wapping, the common resort of sailors and their girls. She had not been there long when who should enter but the aforesaid Bill, not alas in quest of his fair Tasmanian, the fickle swain having a London lass most lovingly in tow. But, however, had not had not doubled the Cape Horn to part with her property in such a way. She therefore laid claim to her man, who was ungallant enough again to lose her. After a fruitless search for her gay deceiver, she made her way to the Colonial Office, where she told her simple story with such wondrous naivety that she succeeded in procuring a homeward passage from the authorities. She had not long regained the welcome banks of the Derwent when Bill, tired of his frolics, returned to resume his former occupation and to make Bet an honest woman. Bill had long been known for being one of the most industrious but wet boatmen on the river. So, let's move on to a bit more. This is the crest of the city of Bilston near Birmingham. Tom Bilston was born in Birmingham and thus indicates his family had status there. Indeed, his crime was forgery of promissory notes. That is, cheques indicating he was of middle-class background and literate. His aunt Preston, left him money, and Bill Wheeler probably left him some too. This is a map of Western Victoria in 1842. This is the area the family eventually moved to, which runs from Casterton and Wannon over around this area. Tom and Anne Bilston had 11 children in all, 10 born in Victoria. Looking at some old photos, we can see we now have reached living memory. This is because my mother, Nancy Clarke, remembers the children as they were aunts and uncles of hers. Now, where are we up to?
Living memory.
Living memory. And this one. We've got old Tom Bilston. My mother, Nancy Clarke, remembers Fred as a bullock driver with a long flowing white beard. Her mother, when she spotted the old man driving the bullock and dray, would stop the buggy, and she and Ward, Mum's brother, would hop in and hurry to greet him. Uncle Fred used to take Auntie Anne, Alec and Frank through the usually forbidden swamps around Casterton in that area. And Fred was a great friend of the natives up there. And we'll hear a bit more about that as we go. This was Anne Wheeler, Anne Bilston, this one. She Lee Wheeler. So she was granddaughter of the ones that were sent out to New Norfolk. This one. Here's Tom Bilston with his two daughters, Mary Ann, who was born in 1840, and Mary Elizabeth, born in 1844. Maria went to Western Australia and became the grandmother of Alexander Stone, who was later the senator for in Western Australia. He only retired about 10 or 15 years ago. Thomas and Anne Bilston had 11 children. William Bilston, born 1836, George Yarra Bilston, in 1838, Mary Ann Bilston, 1840, Thomas Bilston, 1842, Maria Elizabeth Bilston, 1844, Henry Thomas Morris Bilston, 1846, Frederick William Bilston, 1849, Charlotte Bilston, 1851, Alexander Hayward Bilston, named a bit after Hayward as well, 1854, Sarah Frances Ellen Ives Bilston, born in 1856, and Amelia Jane Bilston, born in 1860. So they had a few children. Now, this is George Yarra Bilston. George is known in family history as the first white male child born in Victoria. George scandalised the family by going off to the gold rush, but came back from Bendigo with pots of gold. Family law has it that he gambled much of it. He went then taking his family to Western Australia, where he also mined. His tombstone in Western Australia says that he was a pioneer of the West. There's 3 of Tom's and Anne's daughters. These were the 3 old aunts. Mary Ann Campbell, Sarah Frances, Ellen Ives MacArthur, and Amelia Jane Blackwood. Amelia Jane's the one standing. That was photographed in New Zealand in August 1910. August 1st, 1910. Remember they'd gone to Hamilton, New Zealand. So we ended up in New Zealand as well. Now, this delightful lady over here is Annie Wheeler, or Wally, Annie Wheeler Blackwood, born 1884. Wally was the daughter of Thomas and Amelia Jane. It was Amelia Jane Bilston. So, Wally was sent to the United Kingdom to be educated. On the way, when the ship was in Sydney, she absconded. And the captain in whose charge she was, when he found her, put her under lock and key until her mother finally joined the boat. Children are all the same, aren't they? Maria Elizabeth went to Western Australia and married David Blair Stone, and he's the great-grandmother of the previous National Party Senator Alexander Stone. Maria and David married on the 10th of the 10th, 1880, and thus share the same wedding anniversary of my parents, Cal and Nancy, who married on the 10th of the 10th, 1940, exactly 60 years later. Maria and David had several children, including some that the photos refer to affectionately as our cousin Frederick and our cousin Sam. George Yarra Bilston went to Western Australia and was known as a pioneer there, as I've mentioned. Mary Ann, Sarah Frances and Amelia Jane went to New Zealand, as we've seen on the previous photo. Catherine and Kitty Bilston went to New Zealand as well. And it's difficult for me to sort out who went where. I do know that there are relatives all over the place. Let's move to the 9th child of Thomas Bilston, Alexander. It's a watercolour of the house Wattle Glen, which is near Casterton. It's not Wattle Glen near at all. Oh, this one. This photo. Of the 10 children of Thomas Bilston, Alexander Hayward was the 9th, and is the ancestor of the Hardys and so of the Clarkes. Alexander Hayward Bilston, 1854 to 1916, lived at a farm called Wattle Glen near Casterton, which is a drawing, which was a 5-bedroom house made of a section of mud brick and some wattle and daub. Old Tom himself lived there for a while, although he would have lived much of his time at pub at Hayward. Tom became blind and probably needed some extra care in his later years. Alexander married Catherine Galena Collette MacDonald. She lived from 1849 to 1923. Her father, James, and his brother came from Scotland and settled at Inverell, New South Wales. Then they came to Penola, Victoria, where her brother had a big property. So Catherine MacDonald was educated by Mother Mary MacKillop, with whom there was a long correspondence. Catherine left Penola, came to Castle and lived with Alexander at Wattle Glen. In fact, Catherine MacDonald, who's been my great-grandmother, and Mary MacKillop were cousins.
Is that the same Mary McKillop who came to Nunn?
Yes, it's St Mary MacKillop now.
Yes.
So we're tied up with the sainthood now.
You've got a hotline to heaven now.
That's right, we do.
Oh, we better treat him with respect.
So there's the connection. Catherine MacDonald was my great-grandmother. She was also the first cousin of Mother Mary MacKillop, who educated her at the school in Penola. This means St Mary MacKillop's grandparents are direct ancestors of ours, and somewhere she's a great aunt or great cousin. Wattle Glen was a large station in Casterton, not the suburb Wattle Glen in Melbourne. But now we're entering family history that my mother was part of. Catherine MacDonald, by her marriage to Thomas Bilston, became Catherine Bilston. They had 4 children, including my grandmother Frida Charlotte, who lived from 1886 to 1954. It's shown in the next photo. What's this one down here? It's the Alexander Hayward Bilston family taken at Wattle Glen. So we have Thomas James, Alexander Hayward, Alexander Leo Wiseman, Annie Sarah, Catherine Julia, Frida Charlotte, who was my grandmother, this one, and Katie Maria. All pretty young at that time. A watercolour of the house at Wattle Glen, painted by English governess Miss Moody in 1923. That's this one, and this is followed by a painting of the same copy of the painting that my mother did. My mother had become quite a painter at some stage. Now, Frida Charlotte Bettsworth married Victor Hardy. They lived in a house called Exeter and on a farm called Inverell, which Victor owned and Uncle Frank managed with his wife Annie Bettsworth, who was a Bilston. That's my mother's aunt Annie. Just to show the history is still with us, here's a copy, a photo of Casterton in flood on July 22nd, 1906. Casterton's had a few floods. Now this is Clement Victor Hardy, who married Frida Charlotte. He died at Exeter in Casterton on November 22nd, 1922, aged 38. So this photo was taken when he was about 30 years of age. It's Frida Bilston's husband, and he is the father of, well, what would have been my Uncle Lowen, my Uncle Clem, and Uncle Ward, and my mother Nancy. He came from Adelaide at the behest of Frank Bettsworth, to whom he was related. There he met Frida. Family law says he came without a penny, but this may have been maybe because he loaned his last £10 to Frank, whom he'd met on the way. He probably came from an equally well-to-do family in Adelaide, as Frank Bettsworth was the nephew of Governor Hindmarsh, and his sister, Thelma, still carried the Hindmarsh name. Clement Hardy worked as an accountant and soon owned property, certainly enough for his family to live on without too much hardship after he died at such an early age.
How is the name Hardy spelled? With a Y?
Y. H-A-R-D-Y.
Is that the voted
I think they probably are. Mum thinks that they are. So, I was in Adelaide in about 1980, and I said to my mother afterwards that I'd been down to Glenelg and seen the big statue to Governor Hindmarsh, Canute-like, holding back the waves. This is because I have a feeling it was an earlier statue than the one in this photo that I saw when visiting. And my mother said, "Oh yes, Governor Hindmarsh. He married your aunt, you know." Well, it wasn't quite my aunt, as the reading we've just had was about Victor Hardy says. It was Frank Bettesworth, who was the nephew of Governor Hindmarsh, indicating Governor Hindmarsh's sister had married a Bettesworth. Thus, we're related by marriage to Hindmarsh. Looks like Governor Hindmarsh's sister Thelma continued to be Thelma Hindmarsh. Of course, this section also says that grandfather Victor was related to Frank, but we don't quite know how. This means that Victor himself may have been related to Governor Hindmarsh. We do not know the connection between Victor Hardy and the Hardy wine people of South Australia, but although Mother used to think there was a distant connection. We do know that Victor Hardy's father married a Miss Lowen, which is where we get the name Lowen in the family. My second name's Lowen. I'm Anthony Lowen Clarke. Then I've got young Lowen. The Lowens were shipbuilders in Adelaide and had been whalers in South Australia, but well before it was legal to be there. We do not know how much about the Lowens as she died in childbirth with her fourth child, and Victor's father had to have help in raising the 4 children afterwards. Victor and Frida had the 4 children. Victor died at 42 from a heart attack. After that, Frida brought a house in Williams Road, Toorak, and moved the family to Melbourne. She still owned the farm Inverell, which Frank and his wife Annie managed, as well as owned some rental property in Melbourne. The children continued at private schools, my mother Nancy attending Presentation Convent in Windsor. That's the house in Casterton where my mother was born. The house is still there.
Is it still in the family?
Yeah. Well, no, it's not in the family, no. This is a photo of Grandpa Hardy, that's Victor's father, so it'd be my great-grandfather. He looks wealthy, so I hardly think it was Victor's last £10 that he loaned to Frank. Indeed, I'm pleased to see how well dressed nearly all the ancestors are in these photos, showing that they're all pretty well off, most of the time there. This is the house named Exeter, that's where Victor died. The address was 47 Robertson Street on the corner of Ross Street in Casterton. I've been back there a couple of times this year, and it's still there. It's all been done up recently. Now, this is a photo of what's called the Big Tree at Wattle Glen Farm, or it's called the Bilston Tree as well. And that tree is about 850 years old, and it's used by the Aborigines as a corroboree tree. It has been for a long time. Although when I was back there a few weeks ago, I was told a big branch had just recently fallen off it. This is Nareen Homestead. Remember, Nareen was the former home of Malcolm and Tammy Fraser. Well, it was one of the stations that the family originally owned, and they were the ones who started the early settlement of it. This is the farm at Inverell, owned by Victor Hardy, and the farm there was around 10,000 acres. It wasn't too small. Homestead was an old railway house. It's now known as Benowee. We're meant to have some music now. What do you do when the war's over? Celebrations, of course. So what celebration did we have? This is Lowen Hardy and his friend Harold Ferguson, and they won at the Casterton Peace Celebration, where they won first prize with their boat. But within 20 years, Lowen himself would be at the war, in the Second World War. He was a doctor and became Surgeon Commander in the Royal Australian Navy. The story I know best about him comes from my mother, who was his sister Nancy. Lowen's ship had docked in Darwin. He went up to the hospital. While there, some nurses were checking x-rays in the window sunlight. They saw planes coming and said to Lowen they thought that they were ours. He took one look and knew they were Japanese. As the ranking officer at the time in the hospital, he ordered everyone down to the lower floors and places of safety. This was the first Japanese air raid on Darwin. Lowen tried to rejoin his ship, but it had put to sea in a hurry without him. The ship was never seen again. So Lowen stayed at the hospital for some weeks doing his thing there. Lowen later married Patricia Vaughan. Her father had built Vaughan's Transport. Now, Vaughan's Transport was a very big trucking company around Victoria and Australia. And they'd actually built a shrine in the 1920s here in Melbourne, and they were never paid for it. And they actually went broke at that stage, but they regathered themselves and got going and still built up a very big transporting business. Lowen died in his 40s, leaving Pat with only an insurance policy that had wisely taken out a few weeks before his own heart attack. Well, one wonders, he was a doctor, he probably knew he had a heart attack coming to get out insurance. Pat had 6 children and supplemented her income as an artist and has paintings hanging in the National Gallery in her remarried name of Pat Flood. One of her sons, Peter Hardy, is a professor of art at the Australian National University. Another, Bill, is a well-known Canberra artist and lost his home in the big Canberra bushfires a few years back. Which I remember well, he was preparing a big exhibition for showing at 101 Collins Street. And he lost all the paintings. He had to quickly do a whole stack more, and they were all bushfire type paintings. It went off quite well. Clement Victor Hardy, that's Mum's brother, was a squadron leader in the Royal Australian Air Force and was stationed in Africa. He occasionally would fly up to Cairo and have drinks with my father, Clarke, his brother-in-law, who was stationed there as a staff sergeant. Dad's main role was making sure the local suppliers were paid, which he did so well that he was asked to remain in Egypt to clear things up when most of the 7th Division was sent to New Guinea. Ward Hardy, Mum's other brother, was also in the Navy. After the war, he spent a long time looking after war graves and became an architect. While working at the old Department of Civil Aviation, he planned most of what became Tullamarine Airport. So my mother married Nancy Calvert Croston Clarke, and they have 10 sons and no daughters, and I'm in the middle with the twin brother Jerry. So I've got 4 elder brothers, 4 younger brothers, and a twin brother. So
That must be unique.
yeah. Well, the newspapers thought so at the
10
time.
boys and
Mum had studied to be an artist in her teens and associated with painters who later became known as the Heidelberg School, a racy crowd that she was encouraged to put aside. My mother didn't really like us associating with them, which she did to have a family. She was given this painting here by David Reed, who remained in the Heidelberg School. Now,
is that St.
I don't know, just David Reed. It's signed on the back, David Reed. I've got the painting at home. I tried to find out how much it was worth, and I was told the last painting that went to auction by David Reed had sold for about $5,000. So who knows what it might be worth. Mum in her 60s took up painting lessons again and left us with many fine amateur works as well as many plates that she china painted as well. And I've computer photographed some of these that are around my dome home at home. Unfortunately, Nancy died from heart problems in February 1999. I always maintained that when she was given a pacemaker, that she joined that illustrious English band, Jerry and the Pacemakers.
Ah, the rhythm of life, it's a powerful beat.
Yep. It gave her an extra 10 years, but eventually she couldn't keep up. And I'm sure most of Jerry and the Pacemakers have got pacemakers now. Here's some little photos that Mum did. Got her painting of the big tree, the big Bilston tree. Once she did a photo of Ayers Rock, and that's Mum there. It's all a bit dark at the moment. Big tree at Wando Vale.
The other one,
Well, we've got,
top left hand one?
well, that's the one by Reed. Yeah. And over here, this little coat of arms here is the Wainwright coat of arms. Eleanor Wainwright, but if she was really Esther Eccles, it wouldn't be hers.
No.
This is a painting of Mum done in about 1970 when we lived at what was called the farm at 123 Belford Road, Kew, which was the old original farmhouse in that part of Kew. And she organised for us all to have portraits done at that time. So each member of the family ended up with a portrait, I think, except Dad. She had some artists come in and actually do them all. I've still got mine. Some of the other boys have still got theirs. When Mum died, I organised for her to, on her grave, to for her grave plaque to have on it, from the designs that they had there, a sailing ship. And I put underneath it a First Fleet descendant. And I'm sure that's probably the only grave in Australia that has written on it First Fleet descendant.
Which cemetery is it in?
That's down at the, oh, where is it?
Melbourne?
It's in Melbourne.
North,
Belstrade?
south,
Brighton,
South,
Kew,
east,
down,
Springvale.
not Springvale, not that far down.
Right.
Cheltenham, the new Cheltenham Cemetery. And that's where her mother's buried as well. And Dad died just a few months ago, and Dad's now there as well.
And what was his name?
My father,
Yep.
Calvert Croxon Clarke.
Thank you.
C-A-L-V-E-R-T
Yep.
C-R-O-X-S-O-N. Clarke.
Yep.
No,
He was either Reverend Calvert Barber.
no, I don't, it's not such a name. Now, we'll have a little look at the family. Oh, these are some more paintings Mum did. Mum did a painting of Xavier College in the quadrangle at Xavier. One I did. It's a boat she did somewhere. Now this is of the 10 boys. That was an article in the Xavier Citizen Quarter newspaper that came out. Now here's a pen drawing of Sir Robert Menzies. Now Dad was a great friend of Sir Robert Menzies. Sir Robert encouraged him to join the Liberal Party, become one of the few Catholics in the Liberal Party, and Sir Robert gave him this pencil drawing of himself probably 40, 50 years ago. It's probably, I suppose, quite valuable, I don't know.
Done by her?
I don't know who it was done by, but Sir Robert actually gave it to Dad. And that's a photo of Mum and Dad during the war. Now, going right down to current generation. Oh brother, he's 21 years old today. That's James, the youngest of the 10 sons. We'll go through them. The eldest, Clem, who's involved in computers, and he's got 3 children, 1 granddaughter. I have 2 now. David, who developed some of the early equipment for wind and solar electricity. He and his wife Morgan have got 1 son. Adrian, who's been involved in computers with me and Clem, and we're now involved in, of all things, industrial hemp. And I got a license last week to be able to go and grow a crop of industrial hemp, and we'll be growing a 200-acre crop in Victoria, the biggest. For road, clothing, building, not for smoking. No.
But that's exciting, that's really exciting, because my family had a hemp factory in Yugoslavia.
Oh, okay. Well, I took it through the Liberal Party here. I got Jeff Kennett to legalise it
Yes,
in 1996.
yes.
We had trial licences and all sorts of things. As soon as Brax got elected, he stopped all the experimentation that was going on down at the Geelong Textile Centre that Jeff had set up, and he stopped all hemp happening. There was not 1 licence issued under Brax for 10 years.
Well, that was really silly, because Brunswick was full of road factories.
Yeah, well, he held up everything on this. Caused us a lot of trouble. Anyway, let me continue on. Cal, got Cal here. Cal's an osteopath. He's got 2 children. There's me, many years ago. And I'm a migration agent, and I've helped thousands of people still coming into the country. So,
On boats?
not too many on the boats. No, not on the boats. Mine normally fly in, then try and find some way of staying. My twin brother Jerry here, he produces a line of small phone books up in Queensland, and there's one in Balan Bacchus Marsh, a removable pocket book. They're only small little books, and they've found that people actually carry them and use them. In some towns they've found that the local businesses actually increase their business by 60% because people can find the local tradesmen, which is the normal community phone books aren't even open. We've also got Lowen here. He's involved in croquet. You know
I'm still
Lowen,
waiting for him.
and other mallet sports. He's also written some books called, including Sam the Tram, and Unhook and Live, How Media and Advertising Are Killing You.
I'm still waiting for him, because he was president of our croquet club in Brunswick.
That's right, he was president for a long
When
time.
are we going to get him to talk to us?
I don't know. Paul is
I
involved in
have
computers and lives in Sydney now. Philip lives in Sweden, where he's got his wife and 4 children. He's got 3 grandchildren. Funniest thing was, the first grandchildren in the family came from the 9th son. And James lives in Melbourne with his girlfriend. Now, we've got this article that appeared in the Herald many years ago about the $1 billion Easy Speak. We had developed a computer program. Clem had written the program, Adrian and I and the rest of the family had taken it to the world and paid for it. And we had a deal on the table worth $60 million a year with IBM back in 1977, 78. Clem was, they called beguiled by some lawyers and things, and they ended up stealing the company. And IBM refused to deal with them. They just said, "You've stolen this." But because Adrian had demonstrated to them where they were wrong in their computer programming, instead of taking our solution, they found another way around it. But at that stage, to run a big computer in anywhere in the world, we had to have what was called the JCL man. And he took 11 years to learn what to do. With our program, a person in 3 days could be at the same level as that 11-year person. So it meant that companies throughout the world were held up in what they could do in their whole businesses by this one little person, the JCL writer, who gave back business management control of their business. But we're still pioneers, you know. We're still being pioneers and doing things. Because I've recently built this big dome house up at Balan. that's doing quite well for itself. There's Dad sitting in front of it. And look, the dome,
And your office is in there?
no, yes, I have my
Yes.
office in there.
Because that's where I send letters.
Yeah. It's 3 stories, it's about 50 squares. But having grown up in big houses, I was quite used to a big house. Because in Kew, where we grew up, we had houses up to 100 squares. Back in the days when you could afford to buy them. There was one of them, a 60 square one that Dad paid £11,000 for in 1960. It was sold last year for $3.5 million. We can't afford them. So there's the run through of my friends. We're still doing things. I mean, I take lots of videos and bits and pieces. I do immigration. We've got the industrial hemp happening where we're going to be growing the 200 acres. To be planted in the next 2
So where
weeks.
did you get the seeds from? Were you allowed to import
Seeds are actually from New Zealand, imported into Tasmania. But they're there.
Are you going to start doing a poppy farm too?
No. Poppies are not very safe. Now, we're going to have a little look at Dad's family. Because Dad's family has a history to it as well. We've got General Gordon there. Now that's not General Gordon of cartoon. This General Gordon was related to the General Gordon of cartoon. But that comes from this book called The Chronicles of Gay Gordon.
Oh, Gay Gordon.
Now, Dad is from the Croxtons and Beresfords of England and Ireland. His great uncle was a Brigadier General Jose Maria Gordon. CV. It appears he's not the Gordon cartoon, as I said, but a kinsman. They did meet in the Sudan. But this General Gordon, he started as a policeman in South Australia and rose up to become the person who organised Australia to be ready for the First World War. He actually became the Chief of Staff of all the Australian forces before the First World War. I believe he's the person who set up all the drill halls around Australia. And that's why Australian troops were always good shots, because they'd been trained in all these drill halls. He'd prepared Australia years before the war started. And the book, The Chronicles of a Gay Gordon, the gay refers to his regiment known as the Gay Gordons because of their love of having a good time while still being soldiers. It's not quite the same as now. My Uncle Theo, that's Dad's brother, says he was given this book when he was 7 years of age by his elocution teacher for Christmas in 1926. The book was published in 1921 and was just 5 years old then. Theo would have been about 7 when he got it. Then he showed it to his mother, who we nicknamed Goy, but whose real name was Laura, who said that the Brigadier General was his great uncle. I'm quite sure how it comes about. This means that he was either an uncle on Laura's side or mother's or father's side, or he might have married in his family, but he was definitely a relative. Now General Gordon. Goy, who was Laura Urania Croxton before she married Joseph Clarke, and after Joe's death remarried to Stan Hansen. So that's where the Clarkes come in. They just come in through our grandfather. But Laura's father was Harry Croxton, who was a coach builder, and her mother was Annie Beresford, which is where the Beresfords come into the family, as our great-grandmother. Annie Beresford's parents were Wotherington Beresford and Emma Beresford. I remember once in the 1970s we were talking about setting up a company overseas for the computer business, and I thought, well, we'll drop into the Celtic Club and talk to them, and they said, oh yes, the Beresfords. No, you're not welcome around here. That for the Irish. Because they were the lords in Ireland, the English lords, even though they'd been there for 400 years, they were still classed as English. So we went and set a company up in Liechtenstein instead. Another mystery was solved by Theo on Christmas Day 2008, because I'd always known there'd been some relationship between us and some famous musician you all know, Darryl Braithwaite. It turns out Darryl had married my grandmother's sister was Nellie, Maud. She was Maud, and she had a daughter Nellie, and Nellie was married to a chap called Love, Nellie Love, and then Darryl seemed to have married one of the children of Nellie Love, was either Edna or Betty. So that's where we come to that. And we don't have any more photos. So I've really run to the end of my talk now. I've run through everything that I can. I'm sure there's a lot more I could go back and research, but we seem to be involved in the settlement of Sydney, Norfolk Island, Tasmania, Victoria, parts of West Australia, even had people going to New Zealand. And they've all done quite a few things in their life. And we're still going on and still trying to do things. So I hope you've enjoyed it.
Oh, I must say, I certainly enjoyed your no PowerPoint presentation. Did you get that down? I certainly enjoyed your no PowerPoint presentation. And it wasn't dry, it was quite moist, I thought. Especially the letters.
Oh, I like
couldn't
those
read
letters.
those. Those are absolutely fantastic. My question to you today is, there was shipwrights and that right and the other right. Was a Wainwright ever something like a shipwright?
Wainwright had something to do with making wheels, I think.
Yeah, I think it might have been wheels. I was just trying to think of it.
Yeah, I think they were wheels.
Wheelwright. Yep, good.
Yeah.
Well, I'm done. Thanks for that. No PowerPoint presentation.
Well, you know why it's no PowerPoint? A, because I couldn't be bothered trying to do
I
one.
know that works for me.
But I've been to a series of lectures recently called the Millionaire Mind series of lectures, and they have a thing called Train the Trainer, which goes for about 5 days, and they hate you to use PowerPoint. They want you to use flip charts. And after I'd been to that, I've reinvigorated the whole talk using flip charts.
No, it's good. It's
Well,
refreshing.
that was one of the, I have seen this before. It was 2 years ago, two
Yeah.
and a half, 3 years ago, but I was so impressed at the way we could approach it, we could feel it, because with these PowerPoint thingos, I don't know, it's just not the same, but maybe it's only for us older people, that it doesn't say the same.
No,
the same
PowerPoints
message.
are well known not to work.
Because
Yeah, I
for
think
PowerPoint, they switch the light out and you end up going to sleep.
Well, you go to sleep, but you're concentrating on what's written up there on the screen
Yes.
instead of
You
what
cannot slide.
people are saying.
This is absolutely, I mean, I better not say any more, because I fell in love with this talk 2 years ago, and I've been haunting him ever since. But now my next quest will be to get the brother who was the president of our Thingo Club down the road.
Mallet.
Croquet Club, the Mallet Club. So I have rung him and left messages, I think, but we'll have to resume
Well,
that
he's
quest
very
next
busy.
year.
He's bought this property up at Maryborough.
Lovely spot.
Well, he still needs to share his time with us, because we know nothing. I know nothing about the Croquet Club, and I think we would all enjoy it, because it's
Well, if you can't make it, perhaps you can send down a PowerPoint presentation.
Yes, of course.
Are you going to write, are you able to sort of do a 1 or 2 page summary of this, or shall we just take what Keith has written down?
Just take what Keith's written down, because
Okay.
it's impossible to do a 2-page
All right.
summary.
Right.
Those letters, I think you get that.
a letter, even just a copy of
Fabulous
half
letter.
a letter or something would be really nice.
Oh, well, I can give you
I
copies
would
of those.
love a copy of this a photo of this wonderful lady. Because if it weren't, was it Esther?
Esther Eccles.
If it wasn't for Esther,
Yes, I know. We
none
wouldn't
of
be
this
here.
would have happened.
Mm.
So
For Esther being accused of stealing a petticoat.
right, okay, well, if you've got a nice picture that we could put in our
There is no
publication-
picture of Esther Eccles as far as I know.
No,
There are the photos of her children, when
well,
the children were in their 70s, 60s and 70s.
I
But there
mean,
was nothing
a
of...
little, it's a pity that your mother didn't use her talents and do a sketch.
Well, maybe we could have a photo of an Eccles cake,
Eccles.
traditional English cake, Eccles.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yes.
Well, look, I'll turn on the Ouija board
Okay.
and I'll get Mum to draw up a photo and to transmit it down to
Well,
us.
I just
Perhaps
thought
an aura would
there
do.
might be one somewhere.
aura?
that-
Yes, with her auras. In fact, I shocked the bishop the other day at my Dad's funeral
Hmm.
because I read out a eulogy and I said, well, we'd just seen Dad a couple of days before Adrian and I went off to Germany for a hemp conference, and his aura was getting a bit large, he's etheric. And Adrian was saying, oh, this doesn't look good. I said, well, he's probably etheric's probably getting ready to leave. And I mentioned this in the eulogy I gave, and Bishop from Ballarat was doing it. And he looked askance, he looked a bit horrified that I'd mentioned things like that. But Dad died. This is very interesting. Dad became a Catholic in Jerusalem while he was there. He'd walked the Stations of the Cross. He'd been raised as an Anglican, even though he'd been to Christian Brothers School for a year or two in Malvern. And he, what happened? He walked the Stations of the Cross, and then he decided to become a Catholic, because Mum was a Catholic, he married a Catholic. And then, as we were flying back from Germany, is when he died. And I would bet, if I really map things out, that I'd find that we're actually flying across the Holy Land at the time he died.
Mm.
So,
Bit spooky.
and Dad was also, Mum and Dad were great friends of the Pairers.
Yes.
You know, Tony Parer, the photographer,
Yes.
who photographed all the troops in the
Yeah,
war.
yes, famous period.
Oh, they were great friends.
Gee whiz. Mm.
I'm looking for young Jamie. Has Jamie gone? Jamie is on the, he's a member of the First Fleeters,
All right.
as well as a member here. Because I think you really need to go to the First Fleeters.
I know. We're all eligible to be members, we just haven't.
No, to give your talk.
Give my talk, yes.
The First Fleeters can't be here today because the President works at the races. But he's going to be here giving us a talk about the First Fleeters next February.
Oh, okay.
But I think your presentation would really be wonderful for the First Fleeters. They meet in that lovely Seaman's Mission in Flinders Street.
Yes.
Is
Yes,
it Flinders Street?
This little common street.
No, Flinders
Oh,
Street.
Oh, the one they're about to make changes to along there. Yes,
Well,
I know.
they meet there, so I think that would be really important if you could find some time. And before you go, I need your brother's phone number again.
All right, I'll organise it for you.
All right,
I have a
any
poster.
questions, any comments, any?
Yes, indeed. I
Whatever's-
love this. This is the side that asks questions, and the rest just listen. But Gough Whitlam was going through one of those metal detector things at the airport,
Yes.
and they had the wands and stuff all over him, and the bell went off. Beep 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 beep. And he said, "Don't worry, it's just my aura." I like that story.
I have a poster
We're actually involved a lot with golf.
of the First Fleet, sort of ship by ship,
Yes.
the whole 8 or 9 of them, however many, and also a book published in 1988, I think, the Bicentenary,
Bicentennial. Yeah.
with details, more details of the First Fleet, and somewhere I've got them passenger lists
Hmm.
of the not only the convicts but also the crew or
The crew.
officers on those first fleet sailing ships.
Yeah. Well, that was.
I'd like to bring them to the meeting in case nobody's seen them.
Yes, that would be lovely.
I mean, you know, there are a whole lot of things I haven't gone through in all this talk. Like when Gough Whitlam was Prime Minister, my cousin Lowen went to Fiji and he found out in Fiji that Jimmy Cairns' son had been offering all this money to the Fijian government for this Arab money that was floating around. And he came back and he told us about it, and we got in contact with some people that we knew in the newspapers, and finally, after several months, the Kamlani affair started.
Oh, yes.
And that all started from information that we organised for the papers. And then there was a booklet during that election called The Australian Labor Prison that was put out, and wherever it was put out there was suddenly a big turnaround in votes for the Liberal Party as against the Labor Party, but it detailed the 21 bills that were held up in the Parliament, in the Senate, and all sorts of things, and what was really going on. But my brother Jerry actually wrote that book with John Pinkney. So, and Jerry stood for the Liberal Party about 4 or 5 times. He actually stood up this way. He stood here in Preston in 1970, and he got
He was brave.
an 11% swing. It was the biggest swing in Victoria. Then he stood in Scullin in 75 and 78. 75, he got a 12% swing, and he needed 17% to throw out Harry Jenkins at that stage. And but the extra 12,000 votes he got meant that that year in the double dissolution, 6 of the 10 senators were Liberal National Party, Liberal Country Party. So he got the extra senator. So.
Questions, comments?
I heard there might be a hymn for the first fleeters. And did that fleet in ancient times walk upon fair Australia's shores? And did... I just made that up. But it wouldn't be bad, would it? Work on it. I hope that camera's still going.
That's very nice, no.
Anyway, I've had enough. So thanks.
That was, well,
Give him some
I enjoyed
Docklands,
it
come
better
on.
the second time than the first time, but there's always so much that we can learn from these stories. And I hurry home on Saturday afternoons now because at 5:30 there's usually something like, who do you think you are? It's not exactly who do you think you are, but they work out how much, where your ancestry comes from.
I did want to
It's just so gorgeous.
did want to mention something I thought was in the notes, but it didn't seem to be there. On that Bilston tree, the Bilston tree down at Wando Vale, it was the Aboriginal corroboree tree.
Yeah.
The Bilstons used to look after the Aborigines. The McDonalds in particular, the Bilstons did too, because the McDonalds had all been thrown out of Scotland, and they'd seen people being dispossessed, and they didn't like the English dispossessing the Aborigines of their land. So when, down in the Western District, the Aborigines took Western names, a lot of them became McDonalds, and you can find a lot of Aboriginal McDonalds even now.
So they could choose their own anglicised names, couldn't they?
Yeah, well, they chose McDonald because McDonald's protected them. All right. Well, that's it.
Beat that. But it'd be really good if we started doing a little bit about our background. I haven't done anything about my background either, so we might like to start doing something. Sure, we've got some interesting stories.
All right. Well, it's time to